Okay, welcome everyone. This is Dr. Barrett-Fox, back with you again, talking about technical writing here at K-State in the College of Technology and Aviation. What a thrill to be with you today and to bring us into, I think, a bit of a wider conversation about what technical writing is, what it means, what it's looked like historically and traditionally. And then we'll start to talk about a few of the genres that are going to be relevant to us in week three for the project that we're doing in week three. And so and I think this is important. And just to, kind of contextualize with last week, we learned about the rhetorical situation. We started to think rhetorically, and we started to ask questions about, what's the purpose of a particular piece of communication? Who's the audience for that particular piece of communication? And what are the things that are constraining the success of this particular artifact? And what are the things that are potentially working in its favor, right? So what are the affordances of any particular artifact? And so what I wanted to do after I got my students thinking rhetorically is I wanted to take that momentum and move us into the rhetorical situation of technical writing in particular. And to do that, we start with Susan Last, who we're reading a good bit of this semester. She has this wonderful textbook, this wonderful open access textbook, which is super good. I've reviewed so many of them, and I absolutely love what she does. And she does a lot of work for us in kind of defining what technical communication means. In fact, she says, technical writing is a genre of nonfiction writing that encompasses not only technical materials such as manuals, instructions, specifications, and software documentation, but it also includes writing produced in day-to-day business operations, such as correspondence, proposals, internal communications, media releases, and many kinds of reports. And because oral and visual presentations are such an important part of professional life, technical communication also encompasses these. So we might do well to define technical communication then as using various modes, that is the oral, the written, the visual, various modes of communication to manage technical information, to analyze a problem, to find and evaluate evidence, and to draw conclusions in a way that allows people to take action. So technical writing, and I mentioned this last week, is transactional in nature. That is, it conveys information to enable specific actions. All right, so I wanted to take a quick example for context, and this is something that Last takes from her own university, which is the University of Victoria in Canada, of course. Though this image is actually from the engineering building on K-State's main campus. I like that building because there's that really cool like living wall there. I always enjoy that. I always take my kids there when we're on campus because I like to see how that wall is progressing. But this is really an important way to begin this conversation, because you might think, okay, I'm studying to be an engineer. Most of the time, I'm going to be doing math, physics, and problem solving. But that's actually not the case. And so when asked how engineers at the University of Victoria spent their time, it was pretty shocking to find out that it's only about a quarter to half the time that they're actually solving problems, right? Solving engineering problems. And what we find is that it's actually half to 3/4 of the time that they're spending, in their professional endeavors, they're spending communicating. They're writing, they're reading reports, they're writing letters, memos, proposals, presentations, they're having discussions with colleagues, with managers, with clients. So engineers who are more advanced in their career, for those people, this is actually even more the case. So the higher up the chain you go, the more central writing and communication are to your success. So the more advanced engineers are in their careers, the percentage of time you're going to spend problem solving actual engineering issues goes down and down and down. And the more time you're going to spend communicating about those issues goes up and up and up. So engineers who are more advanced in their career spend only about 5 to 10% of their time engaged in problem solving of some kind, and 90 to 95% of their time engaging in communication related tasks. And so this is, again, researching, writing, reading reports, proposals, emails, letters, memos, or giving presentations or attending presentations. This is important, and I think this is absolutely true probably across most professions, particularly here in the College of Technology and Aviation. Absolutely do you have to know how to do your job, but when it comes to maybe being a manager or an administrator of other people, suddenly you need to not just know how to do your job, but you need to communicate with those people about what expectations look like. And so communication, the further up the chain you go, becomes more and more important. So technical writing, and just to pop back, technical writing then is what Last calls a highly designed form of communication. It's not spontaneous, right? Because it's highly designed, it pays strict attention to who's involved in the situation, right? Who are the practitioners in this given instance, and in those cases, practitioners have to have a heightened awareness of the rules and expectations. We might call those genre conventions. They also need to have a heightened awareness of the rhetorical situations. And it's fun. Last, of course, defines the rhetorical situation as audience, purpose, and context, which isn't that different from Lloyd Bitzer's original 1968 formulation of audience, exigence, and constraints. One thing that Last gives to us, which I think is super duper useful, though, is she offers us a quick little visual of NASA's basic design protocol. It's a process, right? So how do you create something? How do you invent something new? How do you create a new document or a new artifact? And this is a really useful set of steps that we can follow. So it starts with stating the problem. Okay, this is what do I want to achieve in the world, right? Which of course perfectly correlates to Bitzer's sense of exigence. Next, you got to generate ideas, right? This is the brainstorming sort of moment of the process where you're jotting things down on paper, you're making maps. Eventually, you select a solution, you build the artifact, then you start another process, right? Which is evaluating the artifact. Is it actually stating the problem clearly? Is it helping me to solve the problem, or does it take me off track somewhere? So that's part of that evaluation stage. And finally, you present the results. But I thought that was really useful. And I feel like if it's good enough for NASA, then it's good enough for us. But it's really useful. And I'll encourage you all to sort of, if you want to print that out and cut it out and put it on your wall while you're doing the work for this class, it could be really useful because it's so nice to have a kind of codified design process. And that's frankly something that's similar to what I wanted you to practice when I started asking you to think rhetorically or to think about the rhetorical situation. What you'll find is that the more times you apply these heuristics, right, these models for thinking or problem solving, they just get sort of built in, and they become part of the process. So that just gets quicker and quicker as you go forward. But I thought this was a really nice, really useful little design protocol. So if anytime you're sitting down to invent something new, particularly in the context of technical writing, this is a really handy dandy set of steps. Last also gives us another useful sort of problem formulation model. It's not exactly the same as the one we find from NASA. This one is a little bit cleaner in some ways, right? And this comes from again, this is Hyman's problem formulation model, and she says, keep in mind, right, that the document that you produce is evaluated in terms of how well it responds to the problem. That is, how well it responds to the overall goal and demonstrates the achievement of specific objectives while abiding by constraints. Sorry, I see a little typo there. I apologize. I'll take that out and re-edit the PowerPoint slides for you. But I thought this was a super useful one, and I wanted to kind of get this out there, say it out loud. Hyman's problem formulation model, this is, again, another set of steps that you can kind of put in place when you sit down to to envision the kinds of technical artifacts that you might have to generate in any given context. And so for Hyman's model, it's really useful. There are 4 elements. The first is that you need a needs statement, right? And of course, this correlates to step 1 in the NASA protocol as well. In this moment, or in this step, you recognize and describe the need for a solution or an improvement to an unsatisfactory situation. Now, I'll remind you that that's pretty close to Bitzer's language when he's talking about an exigence, right, as an imperfection marked by urgency. So here we have an unsatisfactory situation. That's the thing that needs changing. So in the needs statement, you're going to have to answer questions like, what is wrong with the way things are happening currently? What's unsatisfactory about it? What negative effects does this particular situation cause? You might need to do research and supply some data to sort of quantify these negative effects. After you get your needs statement out there, you're going to have a chance to write a goal statement, right? So this describes what the improved situation would look like once a solution has been implemented. The goal statement defines the scope of your search for a solution. So at this point, you're not describing your solution per se, only the goal that any solution should achieve. So the broader you make your goal, the more numerous and varied your solutions might be. But a narrowly focused goal limits the number and variety of possible solutions as well. And you don't want to go too far overboard in the goal statement. But you do need a goal statement because you need to know what the fixed problem is going to look like. Third section in Hyman's model, which again, I find super useful, is an objectives statement. Here you're defining measurable and specific outcomes that any feasible solution should optimize. And this is how you check your work, right? These are aspects that you can use to grade the effectiveness of your solution. So objectives provide you a way to quantify, a way to measure how well any given solution solves this problem. Ideally, they allow you to compare multiple solutions and figure out which one is most effective and which one gets the highest score in meeting the objectives. And finally, considering the constraints. Again, this is a concept that feels relatively familiar to us. So here you're defining the limits that any feasible solution might adhere to in order to be acceptable. So this is pass-fail, conditions, range limits, etc. The key word here is must. These constraints are a go, no-go condition, right? That they determine whether a solution is acceptable or not. These often require budget, time limits, as well as legal safety and other regulatory requirements. So now you've got the sort of the NASA protocol, and then you map Hyman's problem formulation model on top of that, and you have a really good set of processes sort of from which to begin figuring out what kind of technical artifact you might have to devise and why it would be useful. So when you're developing technical artifacts for this class, there are some conventions that apply to almost every technical genre or genre of technical communication. And I wanted you to keep these in mind. These I take from her table 1.12, the conventions of technical writing. And these are elements to make sure you have accounted for inside any particular technical artifact. And so an artifact is going to have a purpose, right? And a technical writer has to communicate the technical and specialized information sort of involved in that purpose in a clear, accessible, usable manner. And we'll have to communicate to people who need to use it to make decisions or perform processes or support company goals. So the purpose is paramount. The audience also, right? This brings us back to Bitzer. The audience can be varied, but it has to include certain people, right? Fellow employees, such as subordinates, colleagues, managers, executives, as well as clients or other stakeholders, the general public, or even readers within the legal system. But it's critical for you to know who your audience is or who your audiences are, because, you know, some technical artifacts have multiple audiences, sometimes even competing audiences, which can make things a little bit more complicated. In terms of your writing style, in technical writing, we always want to err to the side of concision, of being concise, of being brief, and of being very selective with our word choices. So we don't ever want to make the mistake of rambling on. So clear, concise, plain language, direct language. This might include specialized terminology, but that terminology, depending on who the audience is, might have to have definitions included with it. Typically, you want to use shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs, active voice, and you have to highlight your purpose, in a kind of repeated way, keeping that right in the middle of sort of the bullseye. Tone, this is pretty clear. You want to keep a business or professional tone, which falls somewhere between formal and informal, not like ridiculously formal, but certainly not, hey dude, how are you? Informal as well. You may use first person. I think it's probably it probably depends on the context. And so if the genre that you're working on is a letter or a memo, of course you'll use first person. If it's a set of instructions, perhaps you'll use second person, right? You might be showing the person the steps they'll take using the word you. First, you will do this, then you will do this. Or in a set of steps or away from the genre of the memo into, say, an instruction manual, you might forego second person altogether and just move straight into third omniscient. But that tone is important, right? It has to be courteous, it has to be constructive, it has to be professional, and it has to be, I would say, professional enough. Structure is also important. So things have to be highly structured. Again, you want short paragraphs, clear transitions. And in a lot of these kinds of documents, as we move into documents that are more complicated, like a proposal, you'll probably want to have structural cues like section headings. This moves the reader sort of directly and logically through the artifact. And again, these are particularly important on sort of longer, more sophisticated or technical documents. So in terms of format and formatting, this kind of depends on the genre. It depends on whether this is something that you find on the web or something that you print out in paper. But again, do pay attention to the particular conventions of that genre. And we'll talk about all the conventions of every genre that you're going to have to be responsible for in this class. And this week, we'll talk about all the conventions of each genre that you're responsible for moving through to our second project. So another thing that Lass spends a little time on is her own definition of the rhetorical situation. And, I didn't really want to spend too much time here because I know we've already spent a decent amount of time talking about Bitzer in week 2, Bitzer and Watts, but I think it's nice and it's useful for you to see kind of the development of the rhetorical situation, sort of as it starts with Bitzer in 68, moves to Watts in 73, and then gets sort of taken up by professional and technical communicators. And this is what we see with Lass's little rhetorical situation here. Hers is a little bit more complicated than Bitzer's. Remember, Bitzer's is what? Exigence, audience, constraints. Lass's is a little bit more complex. She's got the purpose, which seems a lot like the exigence. She's got audience, which maps over audience. But she doesn't have constraints and affordances. She has a couple other elements, right? She does have context and culture. And that I think will subsume constraints and affordances. But she's also got the writer and the message in there. And I think those are important and useful elements as well. Because the purpose and the message are not exactly the same thing, right? The purpose and the message are not exactly the same thing. The message is the means by which you are effecting your purpose, but it would be erroneous, I think, to conflate those two. Another thing that Lass does really, really well that I wanted to include in our PowerPoint is that she does a lot of good work in helping us develop an audience profile, and Bitzer does not do this work for us. So anytime you're thinking about audience when you're designing a technical writing artifact, these are the questions that I want you to be sort of mulling over in your head. These are questions that I think you will revisit multiple times this semester. 1, who are your primary readers? Are they above you in the organizational hierarchy? Are they lateral to you? Are they subordinate to you? Are they outside your organization? Who else might read this document? What attitudes will these readers bring to the document or to the topic? How might cultural differences affect their expectations and interpretations? How much technical background do these readers have? How much do they already know about the topic? And lastly, what situation gives rise to this document? And these are all useful questions to keep in mind when developing an audience profile. Keeping in mind, right, as we continue to sort of create technical writing artifacts, that mistakes happen. And I wanted you to know, I wanted you to be able to put some numbers to this, but mistakes happen a lot in business. And writing mistakes in particular cost businesses at around $4 billion a year. Around $4 billion a year. So bad communication is big business. And here I've put in this. There's a really this is one version of a really famous cartoon that I wanted to include here, and it's the project management tree cartoon, right? It's been, and as she says here, it's been used and it's been adapted widely to illustrate the perils of poor communication during a project, right? So you've got, here's how the customer explains it, here's how the project leader understood it, how the engineer designed it, how the programmer wrote it, how the sales executive described it, how the project was documented, what operations installed, how the customer was billed, how the help desk supported it, and what the customer really needed. So, and why include this little cartoon here? We include it because it's critical to know that the absolute sort of power of technical communication, right, when it's done well, is that it disambiguates sort of people's approaches to a particular document, right? The better technical communicator you are, the fewer of these kinds of mistakes or alternate readings that people are going to be able to bring to your document. Another thing I wanted you to be aware of that I think Lass does really, really nicely is that she posits that the design process mirrors the writing process. And this makes sense because in some cases, right, the writing process and the design process may be the exact same thing, but they're not always identical. And I wanted to kind of put these both up here next to each other to give you a sense of what it means. So when I say design process, I mean, how do you come up with something from nothing, right? And again, this involves a set of steps that we feel relatively comfortable with, something that hopefully we will practice every time we write a technical artifact for this class. We're defining the problem. We are generating possible solutions. We're evaluating possible solutions. We're making and testing a model. We're modifying and improving design. And finally, we're communicating our final design. And again, this maps really nicely onto what in rhetoric and writing studies we call the process model of writing or communication. And that is to say that we understand writing to be a process, not a product, right? You never fully arrive at where you're going. Instead, you're constantly putting something out there, making it better, revising, soliciting feedback, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we have down here on the bottom right. We've got the pre-writing process where you're brainstorming, the planning, drafting, reflection, peer tutor review, additional research, and then editing and proofreading. But again, the design process and the writing process for Last and for me and for this course line up with each other, I think, in really, really useful ways. Another thing you can think about, and I'm including these this time because I think sometimes writers can come to a class like this and think, okay, fine, you're telling me about these genres, but you're not telling me about the steps I have to take to get this done. And that's why I wanted to spend some time on these slides. Last does give us, I think, a really nice way into how can I tell whether I'm wasting my time or not, right? And here I have a little funny writer's clock there I took from the Women's Fiction Writers Association. But how do you subdivide your writing time? How do you know if you're spending an appropriate amount of time on each of these steps? And what she does for us is she essentially subdivides this process into 3 stages. The first stage is planning. Planning should take about 40% of your time. This is figuring out what you need to do. That's task analysis. You're talking about it with people. You're free writing, you're drafting, you're researching, you're brainstorming, you're concept mapping, you're outlining, et cetera, outlining. The second stage is drafting, right? That should maybe take about 20% of your time. That is writing a rough draft. And stage 3, another 40% of your time. This is revising. So you're revising, you're editing, you're proofreading. You're testing your artifact out against different audiences and figuring out whether it's working for them or not. Okay, so now I want to turn our attention to some of the genres that we're going to be responsible for in Project 3. And Project 3 is going to be essentially designed as an outreach, right? So you're going to be like reaching out to someone. So it's going to be an email memo that includes your resume. And so we're gonna kill 2 or 3 birds with one stone here in this first unit. The reason for that is because these are relatively simple genres, and so they're pretty easy to practice in tandem, and they tend to go together pretty well in practical terms as well. So I wanted to give you just a sense of kind of what the generic characteristics of each of these genres look like. Let's begin with emails. Let's begin with emails. And so I've already had emails with many of you this semester, which I've enjoyed very much so far. And you'll notice that, right, I made email an important part of the first few steps of this class, not only to get us in touch with one another, but to get people thinking about the kind of nuts and bolts of communicating. So what do you need to draft an effective email? Well, there are a few things, and sometimes the small things can seem unimportant, but the small things are actually very important. The first thing you have is a proper salutation. This is where you are, dear so-and-so, or hello so-and-so. And what you're doing here is you are demonstrating an appropriate amount of respect. You're avoiding mix-ups, right? So you're making sure that you're addressing the proper person. And so, I think this is really important because I tend to get emails from students who haven't had this kind of training, that don't have any header at all. They just start into the body of the email, which of course I find a little disconcerting. So if you were going to draft an email to me, of course because I'm your professor, you would begin with a salutation that says something like, "Dear Dr. Barrett-Fox, comma." So we've got respect built in there, and we have a sense of who you're addressing. Then in the body of the email, you include a clear, brief, or as you're moving to the body of the email, you include a clear, brief, and a very specific subject line, right? That tells us what I'm going to be learning about in this email. And that helps the recipient understand the essence of the message. And then you kind of elaborate that in the body section. And then you close with a signature, which is, of course, a way to identify yourself. So here you create a little signature block that says, sincerely, Bob Smith, and has your perhaps your job information and contact information below. So email's relatively simple. It gets a little bit more complex when we move into memos, but memos do carry some of the same generic conventions as well. And I've included a really nice sample in-house memo here. And some businesses that you work at will have their own memo forms, their own in-house memo forms, which are really useful. So this is what Last says. She says, memos are one of the most versatile document forms used in professional settings. So if you go into any kind of a tech writing environment, or probably most kinds of professional environments, writing or not, you're going to be reading and writing a lot of memos. They're versatile and they are used all the time. Here, these memos are used to pass along information, to outline policies, to present short reports, to propose ideas. They are often used to inform, but they can also be persuasive. So a company institution might have its own in-house style, as I mentioned before, or even a template for you to follow. But typically, this is what we want to see in a memo. Typically, this is what we want to see in a memo. You have a letterhead or a logo that sort of tells you where you are. And so ours would be, the College of Technology and Aviation at Kansas State University. You've got a memo, right, that says memorandum in bold format and a subject line, if it's specific. Then you've got your header information up here. So who's it to, who's it from, what's the date, what's the subject. Then you have a message that begins answering the question, why am I reading this? Why am I reading this? So you start with the header, that is the to, from, date, subject, and then you move into the message, which is, again, answering the question, why am I reading this? What details do I need to know? and then eventually a closing. What am I expected to do now? So in a memo body, you've got three elements: the opening, why am I reading this? The details, what do I need to know? And the closing, what am I expected to do now? So another way to subdivide a memo is to think about its rhetorical features, right? So you can think about the opening statement as sort of situating the horizon or situating the purpose or the context of the problem. Then you move into the context proper, where you offer the background. Then you move into the task segment, where you describe what you're going to do to help solve the problem. Then the discussion segment, where you start with the most general information and move to your specific or supporting facts, including supporting ideas, facts, or research that back up the argument that you're making. Then the closing statement, and then, of course, any attachments. But the closing statement is important. It needs to both be courteous, it needs to be warm, but it also needs to state what action you want your reader to take. Letters, as well, are technical documents that you are going to bump into a lot. And essentially, letters and memos are relatively interchangeable. And what you'll find when we get into the Killoran piece in just a moment is that, of course, they have a kind of evolutionary relationship to each other, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the letter looks something like this, right? So you've got the letterhead again, and this is the sender's return address. You've got the date, you've got the inside address of the intended recipient here. Then you have a formal title, the body, and again, your name and your own position at the end. So the letterhead logo, the sender's name and return address, the heading, this names the recipient, including the address and date, salutation, the introduction, which establishes the purpose of the letter, the body, which articulates the details of the message, the conclusion, which restates the main point and maybe offers a call to action, and the signature line, which in most cases will offer contact information in case the person needs to get back to you. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in terms of technical writing genres for this particular week is the resume, which is going to be included in the work you do for this project. Structuring a resume is very, very simple, essentially. It begins with personal information. So here you'll offer your name, maybe your address, right? If you're applying. So a resume will be something that you send into an employer, for instance, if you are trying to get a job, right? Now, if you're posting your resume to the web, you do not want to include your address, right? You don't want strangers coming to your home. But if it's to a particular job, you'll want your name, your address, telephone number, email address. You'll also want in your resume a quick, short sentence that talks about the objective of the resume. So this statement should be related to the specific position for which you're applying. So it's effective to highlight, in this case, your skill set in that goal statement if you can do it in a pretty precise or concise way. So for instance, I'm seeking a position that utilizes my skills in counseling, research, and proposal writing. Then you'll have an education section where you've got your college dates, your high school dates with some course highlights, certificates, etc. Work and related experience, jobs you've had before, internships, volunteer work. This includes the position title, the company or the organization where it's located, and a brief list of job duties. After this, awards and honors, so any kind of academic or other recognition that you've gotten. Perhaps a small section on skills, so both soft skills and hard skills. So soft skills, I'm responsible, I'm loyal, I'm hardworking. And hard skills, well, I have specialties in research and writing, in Microsoft Excel, in public speaking. And then finally, at the end of your resume, you're going to have a little list of references, 3 to 5 people, including their names, their relationship to you, their organization, and their contact information. So other elements, one tough thing about a resume is that it's essential to keep it short, even though it's your most important information. It feels kind of paradoxical, but that's part of the difficulty or part of the negotiation of the genre. is that it's very important, but it has to stay very, very brief too. So it's either 1 or 2 pages, no longer than that. And a lot of services online, if you apply for a job at a big company, they actually use scanners for these things, for that initial round of reviews. 2 things to know about that. Number one, they're looking for keywords. They're scanning for keywords in your resume that relate back to the keywords of the job search, right? Secondarily, they are easier to read for this type of software if you're dealing with fonts without serifs. So keep that in mind as you move forward as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is John B. Killoran's article, The Rhetorical Situation of Web Resumes. And you can probably imagine the reason I was excited about this particular article is because it's talking about so many of the things that we're involved in for this particular project. It's talking about rhetorical situations. It's talking about how digitality or the web itself changes rhetorical situations from traditional paper-based situations. And it talks about how the genre of the resume has changed or has been adapted to web environments. So this is an article that I found really, really useful. And it's also a good example for you to read of really useful academic prose. And so let's dig into the Killoran piece as a way to finish things up today. So some big takeaways from the Killoran piece, I think of them, one of the biggest is that genres change. And genres change with new context. And this might be a new thought for you all, right? Like, so what's a traditional genre that we might think of? The novel, the sonnet, a haiku. And we tend to think about genres as being static, right? And we tend to think about genres as being static because they tend to function in repeatable social or rhetorical situations. That's why they seem the same. But even though these social and rhetorical situations repeat, right, which they do, right, they don't stay exactly the same. Even though these situations repeat, the context can shift over time, particularly as we see more and more of these genres sort of taken up into the digital sphere. So genres change with new contexts. So we get at this with Killoran on 263 because he tells us, hey, professional communication genres published on the web differ from professional communication genres not published on the web. That is, they differ from their antecedents, and they differ because they were published in a slightly different context. So what are some examples of this? So, on a traditional, say, resume, right? That's what he's talking about. You're not going to find hyperlinks, but on a resume that is digitized, you might very well find hyperlinks, right? So you see print genres adopting technologies like hyperlinks or metadata. You also see, letters being adapted to the epistolary novel. That's a historical example. Memos being adapted to emails. Movies being adapted to interactive videos. So lots of genres change with new contexts. And one of the things that all these contexts have in common, of course, is that they are contexts of digital absorption. So what Killoran wants to do here, and he says this, he says, I quote, I want to adapt Lloyd Bitzer's 3 situational dimensions of exigence, audience, and constraints. Then I want to illustrate how new rhetorical situations of the web can influence a genre. I explore the genre, he says, of the web resume. Drawing on a survey of 100 web resume authors and analysis of their sites, he shows that each of these 3 dimensions of the resume's traditional rhetorical situation has opened itself up to greater diversity on the web. And here I just put the first page of my own CV. And a CV is the same thing as a resume, but a CV is what we call it as academics because it involves our publications and things like that. CV stands for curriculum vitae. So, but here you can see that on the first page of my CV, I've got my name, my current contact information, and then it starts with an employment section and an education section. And we'll dive further into that as we go. So what we see with Killoran here is that it's important to be comfortable with, it's almost like a particle in a wave, right? Like, and I'm an English teacher, right? Not a quantum physicist, but it's very similar, I think, in some ways to a particle in a wave. That is, a genre, when you're looking at it, is static, like a particle, right? But genres over time are constantly changing. Michael Shepard and Carolyn Waters' take on genre change looks like this. They give us 3 different steps. Step 1, you've got an extant genre, right? This is reproduced from a form of medium. Say we have a print resume. Then you get a variant version of that, right? This is the same genre, but with adaptations made to accommodate some kind of a new medium. So I'm including on my CV, not just my education and my work, but my publications. And maybe on my digital CV, you can link to all my publications and read what I've written. And that's a really good example of a kind of a variation, right? That's made to accommodate its adaptation to a new medium. That is the medium of digitality, as opposed to just traditional print resumes. Then you've got, at that moment when that variation occurs and it gets sort of uptaken into a new medium, you get emergent genre status, right? Here we have changes significant enough at some point to even have this thing become its own genre. And so you move from the extant or the replicated into a variant, and then eventually into a full new genre in itself. Not all old genres turn into new genres. Some old genres just stay, they stay what they are, but they get uptaken to new context. And I think the web resume is a good example of that. Uploading a resume to the web doesn't make it not a resume, right? But it does offer different kinds of affordances that really do change, in some ways, the nature of the genre, and invite people in, I think, in a more robust way. I can imagine a resume that has links to a personal introduction video, for instance. So, as Shepard and Waters explain, these generic adaptations are driven by what they call evolutionary force. And what this evolutionary force is essentially, right, is just the new functionalities that are afforded by any given new medium. Right? Genres change by being taken up into new mediums. So what Killoran wants to do is extend this analysis into questions of rhetoricity. So he says, and I quote here, Shepard and Waters' model of genre evolution is presented rhetorically, right? As if maybe rhetoric's not an important part of it. As if the only independent variables were a medium's new functionality and the inevitable march of time. He says little awareness is shown to the distinction between genre progress and genre evolution. The model positions genre as just the proverbial cog in the wheel of technological progress, where a broader perspective on genre evolution would show genres adapting to their environment, that itself would be evolving not just with new technology, but with new rhetorical situations. Now, that's a super complicated quotation. What's the takeaway here? It's not just about genres being taken up into new modalities of communication, right? But it's that new modalities of communication themselves produce new rhetorical situations. So it's a both and in this case. So following Clay Spinuzzi, researchers have recently gone beyond recognizing a new medium as the only catalyst for genre change. Instead, they've incorporated, and I quote here, incorporated rhetorical features such as communication purpose or task, community, and institutional power. All those elements play in to questions of the evolution of a genre, which is now not just the evolution or the change of conventions of that genre, but actually some changes to the rhetorical work of the genre as well. So here we complicate Bitzer a little bit using web resumes as sort of our topo. or topoi. Topoi are in rhetoric, that means places to stand, right? Topos means land. So this is what Killoran tells us. He says the archetypical rhetorical situation for the print resume is familiar to us, right? So you're seeking a job, that's your exigence. You submit to an employer, that's your audience, a single resume, usually limited to just 1 or 2 pages and often accompanied by a cover letter, but seldom by any other genres. Those are the constraints, right? That's all you have to work with. But Killoran tells us that the web resume's estrangement, right, its separation from this original context, from the context of the traditional employer audience, changes it but he argues that the genre, in migrating to independently published websites, detaches itself from its traditional genre system. That is, we're not just sending a resume to a particular or prospective employer now. Now I'm putting my resume on the web for everybody to see, so people might contact me out of the blue. And that really does sort of change the nature of the genre. And it doesn't change the nature of the genre by means of just being uploaded into the digital realm, but that the rhetorical needs of the digital realm are different and the context is different, by means of allowing my, in this case, allowing my resume to be accessed by hundreds of people or thousands of people, without a particular prospective employer in mind, right? And that's going to change how you generate your resume. And I think this is a really fun uptake of Bitzer. So the exigence here is really fun and complicated, right? So he's complicating Bitzer in I think really lovely ways. He says, most workers, managers, business people, and professionals in developed economies who had never hitherto had a need or means of maintaining digitally based public relations for their careers now have web publishing access, right? Hence, the web's hosting new opportunities among those with few established genres for communicating their professional identity, apart from the well-established resume genre. That is, for the first time, you can, and again, I want to say this is a relatively, the article's not old. I think it's 2008, 2009, but it feels old in some ways because things are moving so quickly. But that's right? The fact that your resume can exist by itself in some ways a kind of a context-free zone on the web changes the nature of the exigence. Suddenly, it's a resume that tells everybody what you're doing, but doesn't solicit feedback from a particular employer. So the audience changes. So whereas the print resume usually has been restricted to the private correspondence between you and an employer, a public web resume can potentially reach a worldwide audience. And hence the web is hosting more diverse audiences for this print-based genre, right? It's greatly amplifying the potential audience for this particular artifact. And again, of course, this pertains to all traditional print genres that get sort of digitized and brought into digitality, right? Really does alter the nature of the audience. And constraints change as well. With the shift in the resume's domain, he argues, from a pile on the employer's desk to a digital domain under the control of the resume's author, it's both easy and tempting to get around former constraints on the resume's length and scope, such as by linking such related genres as portfolios. Hence, by posting their work on the web, resume authors can more readily sidestep the print domain's traditional constraints, which is lovely, right? Which is lovely. So you can have your resume out there that's linking to other more robust elements of, things that you've generated and produced yourself. So I think that the most of all of Killoran's sort of constructions here, I think the one that I find to be the most useful is that he says the genre gains dexterity as it migrates online. It gains dexterity, and that is, the traditional print genre gets destabilized, and it becomes amenable to changes that digitality brings along with it. And I think that's hugely important to keep in mind. So again, right, his data set here is lovely, and it's also a good example for you as students about how to do a research survey or research study, right? He studied 100 creators or people who 100 people who put their resumes on the web, and he gets a sense of who's expecting what from this exchange. So as expected, A lot of people put their resume on the web in hopes of gaining new employment, right? We get that. So that's 56 out of 100 people did it that way. But what you didn't expect from this is 46 out of 100 people put it up there to just, quote, inform people of who I am. This is an entirely new function of the resume. Or to seek clients for self-improvement, 45 people, again, an entirely new function. Suddenly, what was a private piece of correspondence between you and a prospective employer becomes a much broader sort of call for potential respondents, right? So you can also publish your web resume, as 42 out of 100 people have done, to enhance your standing amongst your colleagues, to let your colleagues know who you are and what you've done. And this is absolutely what my colleagues who are academics tend to do, is you get your resume out there because you want your professional community to know what you've been doing, because they will follow your work, and that's good for your career. In that vein, you can also use it to inform visitors, to bring visitors to your website, to showcase your design skills, or even to practice making a web page. And so this survey of 100 respondents is super useful, because just in this small little list, and again, this is an extrapolation, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different exigences, 8 different purposes of the web resume, which seems to be a relatively straightforward document that I think probably on face you wouldn't guess could have 8 different uses. Audience changes as well, though. Audience changes as well. So the web resume that is designed to just be there, right, is less audience selective, right? It's designed to have a wider audience. So the web audience is much more diverse than the traditional individual employer. So your web resume can be longer. It can be more detailed. And this is what you'll see in my resume. If you Google me, or if you go to the K-State Salina webpage and click on my picture, it'll take you to my resume or my CV, and you'll find that my CV is very long. And that's what digitality allows me to do. It also allows you to put in different kinds of content. So, and I mentioned this before, hyperlinks, photos, sound clips, links to videos, et cetera, et cetera. It's transsituational. And that means that there are some constraints, right? Like, so you can't convince one person of one thing in a transsituational sort of circumstance, but you can at least encourage people to want to contact you by being interesting and informative. But again, if you do post these kinds of things to the web, I recommend heavily that you don't put your identifying address on there, because you don't want creepers coming to your house. There are constraints here. Even constraints when you put your resume on the web. Certainly the traditional print resume is very constrained by both the kind of conventions of the genre, right? It's going to have this, 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 and this, and by the fact that employers are busy and they have only time to process 1 or 2 sheets of information. So these constraints didn't really carry over to posting your resume on the web, right? Because suddenly you can have a much longer resume because time is no longer an issue. So not all constraints carry over. In fact, almost half of correspondents reported that their web resumes included extra information that was not included in the print resume. Again, digitality affords you time and space to do more things, So there are some takeaways here, and I wanted to kind of underscore these before we end today. And the first is that it's not as simple as to say that genres just change because of a new medium. On one hand, that's absolutely true. Genres change when they are sort of uptaken into new mediums. Yes, that is true. But that's not all. They change because these new mediums are actually new social environments, right? They're new social environments. And remember, Carolyn Miller calls a genre, right, a type of social action that is oriented to particular recurring situations. That doesn't become untrue when something's taken into the digital realm. It's just that the nature of the recurring situation changes. So you're always having to do the work of stabilizing what Killoran calls centripetal forces versus centrifugal forces. So centripetal forces are forces that lead us to the same outcomes, right? And centrifugal forces are forces that pull us in new directions. And I actually included a little article I wrote here back in 2004 about Mikhail Bakhtin's theory of centripetal and centrifugal forces. And I just included that there if people are interested. So at the end of the day, it's important to kind of take away from Killoran's work here that you have to do two competing things, I think, to be a really good technical communicator. Number one, you have to know and abide by the fundamental conventions of the genres in which you're working. Number two, and again, this is paradoxical, you have to be aware of the non-static, dynamic, rhetorical facets of whatever situation that document sort of survives inside. So to be rhetorically informed is to get a sense of not just that genre changes when it gets uptaken into the digital sphere, but how genres change when they get uptaken into the digital sphere. So a person who's sophisticated in this way would explore new media, not because new media are interesting in themselves, though they are, but because new media actually host new rhetorical situations. New media actually host new rhetorical situations. Think about how revolutionary a tweet was when Twitter started, right? This person would also recognize that new rhetorical situations can function as centrifugal forces for genre change, right? So when we uptake a traditional print resume, when we allow it to be taken up into the digital sphere, right, and be a kind of standalone object not meant for any one audience, we can see that this uptake has brought us into a new recurring social situation and has allowed us to change the genre based on the expectations of that particular situation. Finally, somebody who's rhetorically informed to how genres change in the digital sphere would analyze genres through their rhetorical situations, inquiring how genres respond to the exigencies, audiences, and constraints of their new of their new digital environments. So changes in technological media affect changes in genre, not simply based on the formal capacities of whatever medium, but because of the new social ontologies that such a medium makes possible. All right. So with that, I will thank everyone for your time and attention this week, and wish you the best of luck as you prepare for this week's project. And as always, I just want to say I'm always eager to hear your questions, to help you work out things that are unclear. And just remember that as we move through these different rhetorical situations and different genres, part of the challenge is negotiating that paradox between the sort of the static, the centripetal elements of a genre and the centrifugal forces of ever new rhetorical situations. Thanks, everybody.